At 3 a.m., the security alarm didn't stay. In my Westlake Hills estate exploded through the silence like a gunshot that didn't exist but still made the whole world flinch. And the first thing I heard was not fear, but the steady tone of my security system confirming a breach at a property I had built my entire life to protect. And then came the phone call from my night guard saying, "Sir, your son-in-law is inside the main residence, and he is claiming he is the real owner." And in that moment, I should have felt panic. But I didn't, because I had learned long ago that panic is what people feel when they don't yet understand the system they are standing inside. And before I could even respond, I heard another voice in the background. Jason Miller's voice, calm and confident, saying, "Tell him I am not trespassing. I am reclaiming what is already mine." And that was the moment everything shifted, because ownership is not a feeling, it is a record, and records do not lie unless someone has learned how to manipulate them. And I remember sitting up slowly in the dark of my bedroom, the kind of darkness that doesn't feel empty but watchful, while the alarm system continued its quiet, disciplined reporting in my ear, and my guard hesitated before asking again, "Do you want us to remove him, sir?" As if the answer was obvious, but I only stared at the wall for a moment and said softly, "No, let him stay. I want to see how far confidence can travel before it meets paperwork." And that was the first time that night I smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because I recognized a pattern I had seen before in men who confuse access with authority. And before I tell you what happened next, I want to say thank you for being here with me. And if this story speaks to your heart even in the smallest way, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from in the world and what time it is where you are right now, because it still amazes me how stories like this travel farther than the people who live them. And now let me introduce myself properly. My name is Robert Caldwell. I am 72 years old. And what happened that night at 3 a.m. did not just wake up my house. It woke up a truth my family had been avoiding for years, and I never thought I would be the kind of man telling a story like this. But life has a way of stripping away illusions when you are no longer useful to them, and that is exactly what I learned in my own home. But I need you to understand something first. This did not begin at 3 a.m. It began long before that, in conversations that sounded harmless, in documents that looked routine, and in smiles that carried more intention than warmth. And that night was simply the moment everything stopped pretending. Because as I listened to the security feed, I could hear movement inside the house, footsteps measured and deliberate, and Jason's voice again, this time speaking to my daughter Emily, saying, "You don't need to call your father. This is already settled." And I remember Emily's silence on the line. That kind of silence that does not mean agreement, but confusion being forced into obedience, and I could hear the tension in her breath as she said quietly, "Jason, this is still my father's house." And Jason laughed once, not loudly, but confidently, like a man who believes documents will always back him before people do. And I closed my eyes for a moment because I knew that tone. I had heard it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in legal briefings where people assume presence equals power. But what Jason did not understand, and what my own family had forgotten, was that I never built my life on assumptions. I built it on structure, on layers, on systems designed to function even when people stopped being honest. And as I stood up and walked toward the window overlooking the estate, I saw the faint lights of security vehicles moving in coordinated silence across the driveway. And my guard's voice returned, lower now, almost uncertain. "Sir, he says he has access codes that were approved last month." And that was the second time I smiled that night, because I had not approved anything in months, and yet someone had been signing in my name, or at least trying to make it look that way. And I told the guard, "Do not challenge him yet, just observe everything." Because in my experience, people reveal more when they believe they have already won, and that is when the real story begins to surface. And as I stood there watching my own home behave like it was being rewritten in real time, I realized something important was already happening without anyone announcing it. Someone inside my family had started treating my life like it was transferable, and the most dangerous part was not that they believed it, it was that they were beginning to act on it. And just as I was about to end the call, the guard paused and said something that made the air in my room feel suddenly heavier. "Sir, there is something you need to see in the system logs." And when he said that, I knew the night had just crossed into a place where belief no longer mattered. Only evidence did. And I asked him one question, quietly, almost calmly. "What does it show?" And after a brief silence, he replied, "It shows your son-in-law was granted authorization by someone using your legal identity." And that was the moment I stopped smiling completely, because there are many kinds of mistakes in life, but impersonation is not one of them. It is intent, and as I looked out into the darkness where my estate stood silent under artificial light, I finally understood what I was dealing with, and it wasn't just a man inside my house at 3 a.m. It was something far more calculated, because somewhere inside my own family structure, someone had already decided I was no longer supposed to be the one who owned the truth, and the only question left was how long they had been preparing for me not to notice. The moment the security system confirmed what I already suspected, I did not move away from the window right away, because there is a strange stillness that comes after a realization like that, when your mind stops reacting and starts organizing instead. And I remember standing in the dark of my bedroom overlooking the estate in Westlake Hills, watching the faint motion of security lights across the driveway, and I knew that somewhere inside my own home someone had started treating my identity like a negotiable asset. But what my son-in-law did not understand, what none of them seemed to understand, was that nothing in my life had ever been built on assumption, and everything had always been built on record, on structure, on verification. And that thought pulled me backward, not into panic, but into memory, because people do not suddenly decide to overwrite your identity at 3 in the morning without first learning how to ignore who you were for years. And that is when the first memory came back, not sharply, but slowly, like a door opening in a house you thought you had already locked. And I saw myself 20 years earlier sitting at a long conference table in a federal building in Houston, Texas, listening to men discuss assets that had my name attached to them as if my presence was optional. And I remembered one of them saying casually, "Mr. Caldwell, your family trust is stable enough that we can simplify access for continuity purposes." And I remember how harmless the word simplify sounded, how it always sounds when people are preparing to remove your control without announcing it. And I agreed back then because I trusted systems more than people, and that was my first mistake. Not because systems are unreliable, but because people learn how to stand inside systems and move them like furniture. And the next memory came even softer. My daughter Emily sitting across from me at a kitchen table in Austin years later, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she barely drank, saying, "Dad, Jason is just helping me organize paperwork. He understands finance better than I do." And I remember looking at her then, seeing how easily trust can sound like relief when someone else offers to carry what you do not fully understand. And I did not challenge it, not because I approved, but because I believed proximity would keep things honest. And that belief aged badly, like everything that depends on silence to stay intact. And then I remembered Jason himself, the early years when he still asked questions instead of making statements, sitting in my office once in Austin looking at estate summaries and saying, "Sir, I just want to make sure I am not missing anything." And I responded at the time with something simple. "You are not responsible for missing anything. You are only responsible for asking." And I did not realize then how dangerous that kind of sentence becomes when someone hears it as permission rather than limitation. And I stood there in the present again as the memory dissolved, hearing the faint click of my security system logging another unauthorized check attempt. And I realized this was not a sudden break. It was a long accumulation, years of small reinterpretations of my authority. And when I finally picked up the phone again, my night security officer's voice was lower, more cautious, like he was afraid of what the system itself might be recording. And he said, "Sir, I am seeing multiple administrative changes in the estate dashboard over the past several weeks, all routed through family credentials." And I closed my eyes for a moment because that phrase alone explained more than any confrontation ever could. And I asked him quietly, "Who initiated the changes?" And there was a pause before he answered, "It appears to be approved under Joint Family Management Authorization." And I almost smiled again, not because it was amusing, but because I had seen that phrase before in corporate transitions, in estate restructuring meetings, in legal frameworks designed to make erosion look like cooperation, and I could already feel how the story would sound when they told it themselves, how it would be framed as responsibility, as efficiency, as care. And that is when Emily called me, her voice uncertain in a way I had not heard in years, saying, "Dad, Jason is saying you are confused about the access system." And I listened to her carefully before answering because tone matters more than argument at moments like this. And I said, "Emily, I am not confused. I am observing." And she went silent, not because she agreed, but because she did not yet know what question to ask next. And I could hear Jason in the background, not speaking directly to me, but speaking through her silence, saying something like, "It is okay, we will fix it in the morning." And I remember how calm he sounded, like a man who believes morning always belongs to him. And after the call ended, I sat down for the first time that night. Not because I was tired, but because memory was becoming heavier than standing. And I thought about how long it takes for a family to forget the difference between being included and being replaced. And I realized that what was happening in my house at 3 in the morning had already been happening in smaller rooms, in earlier conversations, in decisions I had allowed to pass without resistance because I believed intention would stay visible. But intention hides easily when language becomes polite enough. And as I looked at the security feed again, I saw Jason walking through my hallway as if he had practiced belonging there. And I understood then that this was not the first time he had entered my space without me noticing how far he had already moved inside it. And the system beeped once more, reporting another authentication event, and this time I did not ask who approved it, because I already knew the answer would not be a name. It would be a history, and history, once rewritten carefully enough, always begins to look like it was never questioned at all. The system log was still updating when I first noticed a change in tone inside my own house, not through sound, but through data, because data does not lie. It only accumulates until it becomes impossible to ignore. And on the security feed, I could see Jason moving through the hallway of my Westlake Hills estate with the familiarity of someone who believes repetition has already earned him belonging. And I remember sitting in silence as the screen refreshed, showing time-stamped entries of access attempts that did not match any approval I had ever given. And that was when Emily's voice came through the phone again. But this time it was different, less certain, more defensive, as if she was standing between two versions of reality. And she said, "Dad, Jason is not trying to take anything. He is just trying to protect the family assets." And I remember pausing before I answered because language like protect has always been the first mask of control. And I said quietly, "Protect from what exactly?" And there was a delay, the kind of delay that tells you someone is not thinking, but translating. And she finally said, "From confusion, from mistakes in the trust structure." And that word, structure, landed heavier than she intended, because structures do not confuse themselves, people manipulate them. And before I could respond, I heard Jason's voice in the background, now closer, more confident, saying, "Robert has not been involved in the financial side for years. It is normal for authority to shift." And I remember that sentence more clearly than anything else because it was not aggressive. It was worse. It was reasonable, and reasonableness is often how displacement begins. And I stood up slowly and walked toward the security console where the full administrative log was displayed. And I saw it. Small entries at first, then expanding permissions, then what looked like routine adjustments to trust access layers, all marked with electronic signatures that were not mine. And I asked the guard on the line, quote, "Who approved administrative escalation?" And he hesitated before saying, "It appears to be coming through family authorization protocols linked to your estate attorney's system." And that was the moment I felt the first real fracture, not emotional, but procedural, because when systems start referencing authority that no one can directly trace, you are no longer dealing with disagreement, you are dealing with substitution. And I remembered something from years ago, a meeting in Dallas where a younger legal advisor told me, "The most effective transitions are the ones that feel like maintenance." And I did not fully understand it then, but I understood it now, because maintenance is what people call it when they are quietly replacing the owner. And as I continued watching the feed, I saw Jason stop in the hallway outside my office, looking at the framed photographs on the wall, the ones that represented decades of decisions he had never been part of. And I heard him say to Emily, "Your father built things in a different era. This system needs modernization." And I remember Emily replying softly, "He still lives here." And Jason answering without hesitation, "Not in the way that matters anymore." And that sentence carried something colder than anger, because it was not about disagreement, it was about replacement logic. And that is when I realized I had underestimated not his ambition, but his interpretation of proximity, because people who stand near your life long enough begin to believe they are part of its authorship. And I felt the memory of earlier years return again, the first time Jason asked for access codes under the explanation of convenience, the first time I was told that involving him would reduce friction, The first time Emily said, "He is just helping me understand things," and I had allowed small permissions because nothing in isolation looked dangerous, and that is how systems are actually taken, not in leaps, but in permissions that feel too small to refuse. And I turned back to the phone as the guard said, "Sir, there is another issue. The access protocol has been temporarily locked under administrative override." And I asked, "By whom?" And he answered, "By the same credentials that initiated the trust adjustment last month." And I felt something shift at that moment. Not fear, but clarity, because now there was continuity, and continuity means intention, and intention means responsibility. And before I could respond, Jason's voice came through the house intercom system itself, something that should not have been active at that hour, saying calmly, "Robert, I know you were watching the system. There is no need to make this complicated. Everything is already documented." And I stood still when I heard that because he was not guessing anymore. He was confirming awareness, and I walked slowly toward the console and pressed the internal channel and said, "Jason, documents do not create ownership. They only record claims," and there was a short silence before he replied, "Then you will not mind if we verify those claims in person." And I remember looking at the live camera feed again, seeing him now standing in my study holding a folder I had never authorized him to access. And I understood in that moment that something fundamental had already been crossed without permission, not just into my house, but into my records, into my identity framework, into the structure that was supposed to define what belonged to whom. And I asked the guard one final question, very quietly. "Has anyone verified my direct override access tonight?" And he answered after a pause, "No, sir. It appears your override credentials are currently inactive in the system." And I remember that sentence more than anything else, because there are moments in life when you are not being challenged. You are being erased in real time. And as I stood there listening to the sound of my own system treating me as optional, I realized Jason had not only entered my home, he had entered the space where authority is recorded, and somewhere inside that silence, I knew this was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about whether my identity had already been rewritten before I even arrived at the door. The silence inside my house was no longer silence in the way people usually understand it, because real silence has texture, it has weight, it has meaning. And as I stood in front of the security console watching the system treat my identity as temporarily inactive, I realized I was no longer reacting to events. I was reading them like a map that had been redrawn without my permission, and Jason's voice still echoed faintly through the internal intercom channel as if the house itself had been taught to speak against its owner. But what changed everything in that moment was not another alert, not another log entry, but a third presence entering the system, because the guard suddenly straightened his tone and said, "Sir, there is someone requesting secure line access. He says he knows you personally." And I asked quietly, "Name?" And there was a pause before he answered, "Thomas Reed." And for a moment I did not respond, because names like that do not simply appear at 3 in the morning without pulling something from the past with them. And I remember walking slowly down the hallway toward my private office as the house lights adjusted automatically to motion, each step feeling less like movement and more like returning to a version of myself I had not accessed in years. And when I entered the office, the security screen had already flagged an external clearance request at the perimeter gate, and through the audio feed I heard a voice I had not heard in over a decade, older now, but unchanged in its discipline, saying, "This is Thomas Reed, former military security contractor, requesting immediate confirmation of Robert Caldwell's status." And the guard hesitated, then replied, "We have the homeowner on internal line, but his credentials are currently showing limited authorization." And I closed my eyes briefly because hearing your own authority described as limited is a particular kind of distortion that only systems can create. And then I took the line myself and said, "This is Robert Caldwell. Open the gate." And there was a pause on the other end, a pause that carried recognition more than doubt. And then Thomas Reed responded, "Sir, I did not expect to hear your voice on a compromised channel." And I remember that word, compromised, because it was not fear that entered the conversation then. It was understanding, and I asked him calmly, "What are you doing at my property?" And he answered, "I was called by an old protocol flag tied to your estate override sequence. It triggered in the federal contractor network." And at that moment, I understood something critical. Someone had not only touched my estate system, they had touched the legacy identifiers that connected my private structure to external security archives. And that level of access does not happen casually. It happens when someone knows exactly what they are looking for. And before I could respond further, the camera feed shifted to the front gate, showing Thomas Reed standing under the dim exterior light, no longer in uniform, but carrying himself in the same way I remembered, steady, precise, observant, and when he was finally admitted inside the perimeter, he did not hesitate. He simply walked in like a man confirming a known environment, and within minutes he was inside my office, and the moment he saw me, the entire tone of the night changed. Because recognition is not just visual, it is structural. And he stopped in the doorway and said quietly, "Robert Caldwell, they told me you were no longer active." And I replied, "Active is a word people use when they do not understand continuity." And for the first time that night, I saw uncertainty in someone else's eyes. Not confusion about the situation, but recognition of scale. And Thomas stepped closer to the console, scanning the system logs without touching anything, then said, "This is not a standard estate override issue, sir. This is layered authorization drift." And I asked him, "Explain." And he exhaled slowly before answering, "Someone has been cascading permission updates through legacy trust architecture tied to your identity signature. It is not brute force. It is administrative recursion." And I remember how carefully he chose those words. Because professionals do not exaggerate when they realize the subject is real. And at that moment, I heard another voice behind me. Emily had entered the office without me noticing, her presence quiet, uncertain, and she said, "Dad, Jason is trying to fix everything. He said there was a mistake in the system." And I turned slowly to face her, not with anger, but with something heavier, the kind of stillness that comes when truth has already begun assembling itself. And I said, "Emily, mistakes do not rewrite ownership logs across multiple layers of authorization." And she shook her head slightly, as if trying to reject what she could not yet accept. And then Thomas spoke again, this time more carefully. "Sir, I need to confirm something." And I nodded. And he continued, "Is Jason Miller currently holding any formal fiduciary role in your trust structure?" And I answered, "No." And he looked at the screen again and said, "Then he should not have been able to initiate any of this at all." And that sentence created a silence in the room that felt different from the earlier ones, because this silence was not emotional. It was procedural, and procedures, once broken, do not argue, they collapse. And I watched Emily slowly turn her head toward the screen as if seeing it for the first time, and I could tell she was no longer listening to explanations. She was searching for certainty, and Thomas finally stepped back and said quietly, "Sir, I have seen intrusion patterns like this only once before, and it ended with federal review of estate misrepresentation cases." And I asked him, "Are you saying this is deliberate?" And he nodded once and said, "I'm saying someone understood exactly what layer to touch so it would look like consent." And at that moment, I realized Jason was no longer just inside my house. He was inside the interpretation of my authority, and Emily whispered, almost to herself, "He told me it was just paperwork." And I looked at her then, not as a judge, not as a father correcting a mistake, but as someone watching the consequences of trust being repurposed, and I said quietly, "Paperwork is never just paperwork when it begins to replace the person who signs it." And Thomas looked between us and added, "Sir, if what I am seeing is correct, then your system was not bypassed. It was reclassified." And I understood exactly what that meant, because reclassification is not theft, it is transformation, and transformation is always harder to detect than force. And as I turned back to the screen, one more alert appeared, this time not from inside the house, but from the external legal registry node connected to my estate file. And Thomas read it before I could and said, "Someone has just filed a verification claim under your identity authorization key." And I stood still because I knew then that the night was no longer about who was inside my home. It was about who had already started speaking on my behalf outside of it. And as I looked at Emily's face, and then at the security logs flashing silently across the screen, I realized the most dangerous moment had already passed without anyone noticing, because the real breach was not the alarm at 3 in the morning. It was the point at which my name stopped, meaning only me. The room remained still even after Thomas Reed finished speaking, not because there was nothing left to say, but because certain sentences do not invite immediate response. They demand processing, and I could feel Emily standing behind me in that silence, waiting for something to return the world to its previous shape, but the world had already shifted too far for that. and I turned my attention back to the security console where multiple authorization layers were still updating in real time, each line of data confirming that someone had been operating inside my estate structure with a level of familiarity that could only come from prolonged observation. And Thomas stepped closer to the screen again, narrowing his eyes slightly as if reading a language that only professionals in his field fully understand. Then he said quietly, "Sir, I need to ask you something that may sound unusual," and I nodded without looking away from the data stream. And he continued, "Have you ever authorized dual identity verification within your trust ecosystem through external counsel in Houston or Dallas?" And for a moment, I did not answer because that question was not about paperwork. It was about memory. And memory is where most people lose control without realizing it. And then something surfaced, not fully formed, but precise enough to matter. A meeting from years ago, a recommendation from an estate consultant who said, "For continuity across generations, we sometimes embed secondary verification keys tied to legacy identity profiles." And I remember signing a modification that was described as protective redundancy, and I remember thinking at the time that redundancy meant safety, not vulnerability. And I said slowly, "There was a secondary authorization layer implemented years ago under legal advisory." And Thomas exhaled once, almost imperceptibly, and said, "Then that is likely what was leveraged." And I finally turned toward him and asked, "Leveraged by whom?" And he did not answer immediately, because professionals do not speculate until they are certain enough to speak. And when he finally did, he said, "By someone with partial knowledge of your historical access architecture, not enough to own it, but enough to imitate it." And I felt something tighten in the room, not fear, but recognition, because imitation is always more dangerous than direct theft when it comes to identity systems. And Emily stepped forward slightly and said, "Dad, Jason would never understand systems like that. He is not technical." And I looked at her then, not with judgment, but with clarity, and I said, "He does not need to understand the system if someone inside it is helping him translate it." And that sentence changed the air between us, because realization rarely arrives as a single moment. It arrives as permission to reinterpret what you have already seen. And Thomas tapped lightly on the screen and said, "Sir, there is another layer here, a trust interface bridge that appears to have been activated through family consent protocol." And I asked him, "Explain in plain terms." And he responded carefully, "It means someone inside your authorized circle validated external instructions as if they were yours." And I could feel Emily's breath catch slightly behind me, because she understood enough to realize what that implied. And I turned back to the logs and saw timestamps stretching back weeks, subtle permission escalations, administrative adjustments that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern of gradual substitution. And I said quietly, almost to myself, "So, it was not one decision." And Thomas replied, "No, sir, it was a sequence." And there is something profoundly different about sequences, because sequences remove guilt from single actions and distribute it across time, making it easier for everyone involved to believe they were not responsible for the outcome. And then Emily spoke again, her voice softer now. "Jason said this was all necessary because the estate was becoming too complicated." And I paused before answering because I understood what she was really saying. She was repeating language she had been given, not conclusions she had formed, and I said gently, "Complexity is often what people call something they are no longer fully controlling." And Thomas leaned back slightly from the console and said, "Sir, I am beginning to see a full reconstruction attempt here, not just access changes, but narrative alignment." And I asked him what he meant, and he replied, "Someone is trying to make the system reflect a version of reality where they are already authorized." And I remember the room becoming quieter after that, because narrative alignment is not a technical issue. It is an identity takeover strategy. And at that moment, a new notification appeared on the external legal registry feed. And Thomas read it first and said, "There is a pending confirmation request tied to your estate signature profile." And I asked, "Can it be traced?" And he shook his head slightly and said, "Not without full administrative reversal access, which currently appears restricted." And I felt the weight of that statement settle in, because restricted access does not mean absence of truth. It means containment of truth. And Emily finally asked, almost in a whisper, "Dad, what are they trying to do?" And I looked at her for a long moment before answering, because the truth is never simple when it arrives late. And I said, "They are trying to make my absence feel legally consistent and there was silence again. But this time it was different, because silence was no longer confusion. It was comprehension beginning to form, and Thomas added quietly, "Sir, if this continues at this level, your identity signature will no longer be treated as primary within the system." And I nodded slowly because I understood what that meant better than anyone else in the room. And as I turned back toward the security feed, I saw Jason in the study holding a document that had been generated through channels that should not have been active. And I realized then that what I was witnessing was not just access misuse. It was a coordinated rewriting of authority that had been carefully staged over time. And Emily stood still behind me, no longer defending, no longer denying, just watching the screen as if trying to find the version of events she had been told to believe. And I said softly, not to her, not to Thomas, but to the system itself, "Show me the original authorization trail." And for the first time that night, the system hesitated before responding, as if even it was no longer sure whose instruction mattered most. The moment I requested the original authorization trail, the entire system felt different. Not slower, not faster, but more deliberate, as if it had finally been asked a question it had been preparing to answer for a long time. And the screen in front of me refreshed with a level of detail that was not normally visible in standard estate interfaces, layers of time-stamped authentication entries unfolding one by one, each line carrying a quiet weight that no one in the room could ignore. And Thomas Reed leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing as he read the first sequence. While Emily remained still behind me, her presence no longer defensive, only uncertain, and then Thomas spoke in a low voice. "Sir, this is not a single authorization chain. This is a reconstructed identity pathway." And I did not respond immediately because I was following the data myself. And what I saw confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. That somewhere between the formal trust structure and the operational access layer, someone had introduced a mirrored identity profile, not replacing mine directly, but running parallel to it. And that distinction mattered more than anything else, because parallel authority is how systems are quietly rewritten without triggering alarms. And as I traced the entries backward, I saw the first point of divergence, a family consent validation filed through an internal advisory channel, followed by incremental access expansions that appeared routine in isolation, but together formed a continuous substitution pattern. And Thomas exhaled slowly and said, "This is structured authorization drift. Someone has been normalizing illegitimate access over time." And I finally spoke, my voice calm, almost detached. "This means my authority was not taken, it was diluted." And those words hung in the room longer than I expected, because dilution is harder to confront than theft. It feels less violent, more administrative, and therefore easier for people to ignore until it is complete. And then Emily stepped forward slightly and said, "Dad, Jason said everything was reviewed by the attorney." And I turned to her then, not with anger, but with clarity, because I needed her to understand the difference between approval and assumption. And I said, "Emily, an attorney can validate documents, but they cannot validate intent they were never shown." And for the first time, she did not respond immediately. And I could see something shifting in her expression, not belief yet, but instability in what she had been holding onto. And then the security system issued another update, this time flagged as external legal synchronization request. And Thomas read it before I did, his tone tightening slightly as he said, "Sir, there is an active confirmation attempt being submitted to the county registry under your identity signature." And I asked quietly, "Is it authorized?" And he shook his head and replied, "It is attempting to validate itself through prior consent layers." And that was when Jason's voice returned through the intercom system again, no longer calm this time, but controlled in a way that was trying to remain calm. And he said, "Robert, I need you to stop interfering with the system. You are creating unnecessary legal confusion." And I walked closer to the console and pressed the direct audio channel, and I replied, "There is no confusion in a system that records timestamps correctly." And there was a pause before he responded, "You are misreading what you are seeing. Emily and I have been managing this estate for months." And when he said managing, I heard what he was really doing, which was reframing access as responsibility. And I answered slowly, "Managing does not create ownership." And that was when his tone changed, just slightly, a fracture in confidence. And he said, "We are trying to protect this family from internal misalignment." And I turned my head slightly toward Emily, because that phrase was not new to her. It had been rehearsed, and she whispered almost reflexively, "Dad, he is just trying to keep everything stable." And I looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Stability is what people call it when they are already in control of something they should not be controlling." And Thomas interrupted quietly, "Sir, the external registry request has now escalated to verification hold status, meaning it cannot proceed without direct confirmation from your verified identity layer." And I nodded once because that was expected, because systems eventually stop cooperating with contradiction, and then Jason's voice came again, sharper now, saying, "This is exactly what I mean. You are destabilizing everything by refusing to acknowledge the updates," and I responded without raising my voice. "I acknowledge every update that has a valid authorization source." And there was silence on the line, not disconnected silence, but human silence, and I could hear him breathing through the intercom before he said, "You are not thinking clearly about how modern estate management works." And I replied, "I have been thinking about estate systems longer than you have been inside them," and that was the first time he did not respond immediately, and I saw Thomas glance at me briefly, not surprised, but confirming something he already suspected, and then the system displayed a new alert, audit escalation initiated, triggered by conflicting identity validation attempts, and I felt Emily shift behind me, her voice smaller now as she said, "Dad, what happens if the system decides there are two versions of you?" And I answered her calmly, "Then the system stops accepting assumptions and starts demanding proof." And Jason suddenly spoke again. But now the tone had changed completely, the control slipping, and he said, "This is ridiculous. I was given authority by family consensus." And Thomas immediately responded, "Not to him, but to me. Sir, that claim is not supported by any verified legal signature chain." And I turned slightly toward the screen and said, "Jason, if you were given authority, show the signed chain." And there was a pause, longer this time, and when he finally spoke again, there was something different underneath the words, less certainty, more displacement, and he said, "The attorney handled it. I did not need to review every step." And I replied quietly, "That is exactly where the system stops recognizing you." And in that moment, the screen updated again, and this time it was not a request, not a log, but a verification rejection notice, stating that all recent authorization attempts tied to the secondary identity profile were pending invalidation, pending audit confirmation, and Thomas read it aloud slowly, and I heard Emily take a breath behind me as the meaning settled in, because this was no longer interpretation, it was procedural collapse, and Jason's voice came through one last time, no longer controlled at all, saying, "This is not over. There has to be a mistake in the verification layer." And I looked at the screen one final time before answering him, and I said, "Mistakes do not produce consistent timestamps across multiple systems." And there was nothing after that. No argument, no correction, only silence. And as I stood there watching the audit protocol fully engage across my estate system, I realized something simple and unavoidable had already begun. Not a conflict, not a dispute, but a correction, and in that correction, every version of authority that could not prove its origin was beginning to dissolve in real time. The moment the audit protocol fully engaged across my estate system, something unexpected happened that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with people. Because systems do not create conflict, people inside systems do, and I was standing in my office watching the final verification layer lock in when I heard footsteps behind me. Not Emily's hesitant steps, not Thomas Reed's disciplined movement, but something sharper, more agitated, and when I turned slightly I saw Jason standing at the doorway with a face that no longer carried confidence, only pressure trying to hold itself together, and behind him Emily stood in silence that felt heavier than anything the system had produced that night, and Jason spoke first, too quickly, as if speed could restore control, saying, "This is getting out of hand. Robert, you are freezing legitimate family operations." And I looked at him without moving and replied, "Legitimate operations require legitimate authorization," and that was all I said, nothing more. Because at this stage, explanation is not persuasion, it is confirmation, and behind Jason I saw Emily shift her weight slightly, and I could tell she was no longer aligned with him in the way she had been earlier, not fully, not decisively, but enough for uncertainty to start breaking structure. And Jason turned toward her immediately, "Not me," which told me everything about where his control had always been anchored. And he said, "Emily, tell him this is normal estate processing." This is exactly what your attorney explained, and for a moment she did not respond. And in that silence, something fragile inside the room began to collapse, because silence in a moment like that is not emptiness, it is transition. And Emily finally said, I do not understand why the system is rejecting everything you did. And Jason's expression tightened, not at me, but at her. And he said, because your father is interfering with standard procedures, and that word, interfering, was interesting because it assumes ownership already exists and resistance is the problem, and I watched Emily look between both of us, her voice lowering as she said, but Dad is saying none of it matches his authorization, and Jason immediately responded, he is misreading the logs, and Thomas, who had been standing quietly near the console, finally spoke, calm and precise, saying, Sir, the logs are not subject to interpretation, they are timestamped system events. And that was when Jason snapped his attention toward Thomas for the first time, realizing there was another authority in the room that did not belong to family narrative. And he said, who even are you? And Thomas replied simply, someone who verifies systems for a living. And the tension in Jason's voice changed again, because when people encounter neutral expertise during a losing argument, they often try to shift to authority conflict instead of evidence. And Jason turned back to me and said, you are letting outsiders override family decisions. And I answered calmly, there are no family decisions in a system that requires legal confirmation, and that sentence hit differently because it removed emotion entirely from the equation. And Jason took a step forward, his voice rising slightly as he said, I have been managing this estate for months. I have handled bills, coordination, taxes, everything. And Emily immediately interrupted him, her tone sharper now, saying, you said you were helping, not managing. And I saw Jason pause, just for a fraction of a second. And that pause was the first fracture, because contradictions inside a constructed narrative always appear before collapse. And he turned toward her and said, that is the same thing. And Emily shook her head slowly and replied, no, it is not. And I did not intervene, because I did not need to. And Thomas quietly added, Sir, audit confirmation has now escalated to full identity reconciliation protocol, and Jason immediately reacted, saying, that is exactly what I am talking about. He is escalating unnecessary legal processes, and I replied, no, I am allowing the system to resolve conflicting claims, and that was when Jason turned fully defensive, his voice now less controlled, saying, you are punishing me for trying to keep things stable. And Emily looked at him for a long moment and said, why does it feel like you needed control more than stability? And that question did something I did not need to complete, because it landed in a place where arguments cannot survive. And Jason tried to respond. But for the first time, there was no clean sentence available, only fragments. And he said, this is not how it was supposed to go. And that statement is always the beginning of unraveling, because expectation collapse is where systems of manipulation lose coherence. And I stepped slightly toward the console and said, what was supposed to go? And Jason looked at me then, and for the first time that night, there was no confidence left in his expression, only pressure without structure. And he said, you were supposed to review it, not lock everything down. And Thomas immediately responded, Sir did not initiate the lock, the system did. And that correction mattered more than any accusation, because it moved responsibility away from emotion and back into process. And Emily turned fully toward Jason now, her voice quieter but firm, saying, did you change anything without telling me? And Jason hesitated again, and that hesitation was enough, because in systems like this, hesitation is confession without words. And he said, I was trying to simplify things for both of us. And Emily replied immediately, simplify what? And Jason's voice broke slightly as he said, the structure was too complicated, too many layers, too much distance from actual control. And I understood then that his goal had never been partnership, it had been consolidation. And Thomas looked at me and said quietly, Sir, secondary identity alignment is now fully rejected across all registry nodes. And Jason reacted instantly, saying, that is not possible. I was given access. And I replied calmly, access is temporary, authorization is conditional. And Jason shook his head now, frustration replacing control, saying, you are rewriting everything. And I answered, no, I am allowing everything to be verified. And that distinction mattered, because rewriting implies creation, verification implies truth, and truth does not require permission. And Emily finally stepped back slightly, looking at Jason as if seeing him differently for the first time, and she said softly, "You told me it was already approved." And Jason turned toward her quickly, saying, "It was. I saw the documents." And Thomas interrupted quietly, "Documents can be generated without authority." And that sentence landed with finality, because it removed the last remaining support structure, and Jason stood there for a moment without speaking, looking at all three of us as if trying to find a version of reality that still held, but there was none left that matched his narrative, and I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I simply said, "This is what systems do when they stop recognizing unauthorized continuity." And in that moment, Jason was no longer arguing against me, or Thomas, or even Emily. He was arguing against a structure that had already stopped acknowledging him. And that is when I realized I had not needed to push anything at all. Because once the system begins to correct itself, people who depended on misalignment always collapse under the weight of their own explanations. The moment Jason's voice finally disappeared from the system feed, it was not replaced by celebration or relief, but by something far quieter, a kind of structural silence that only appears after a long instability finally stops oscillating. And I remember standing in my office at Westlake Hills, watching the last of the audit notifications settle into a completed state, each line of data now marked with a final confirmation stamp that no longer required interpretation, and Thomas Reed remained near the console for a few seconds longer than necessary, scanning the closure logs as if ensuring the system would not reverse itself, while Emily stood further back in the room, no longer aligned with Jason, no longer resisting reality, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar to her, as if she was finally seeing the house without the filter of someone else's explanation. And then Thomas spoke quietly. "Sir, the identity reconciliation protocol is complete. All unauthorized access layers have been revoked." And I nodded once, not because I felt victory, but because there was nothing left to verify. And I turned away from the screen because looking at it any longer would only anchor me to something I was no longer interested in carrying. And for the first time that night, I noticed how tired my body actually was, not from conflict, but from holding attention at a level that no longer belonged to my daily life. And I walked slowly toward the window overlooking the estate grounds, where the early hint of morning light had begun to soften the edges of the property, and everything outside looked unchanged, which is always the strange part about moments of internal collapse. The world refuses to reflect what just happened inside it. And behind me, I heard Emily finally speak, her voice uncertain but no longer defensive, saying, "I did not know it had become like this." And I did not turn immediately, because I needed to understand what she meant. And I replied gently, "It did not become like this overnight." And there was a pause before she said, "I think I stopped seeing it clearly." And those words carried more honesty than anything she had said earlier that night. And I finally turned to face her, and I saw not an opponent, not a defender of someone else, but a daughter standing in the aftermath of a misunderstanding she had inherited without realizing it. And I said quietly, "You were given explanations before you were given facts." And she lowered her gaze slightly, not in shame, but in recognition. And Thomas, sensing that the operational part of the night had ended, stepped back from the console and said, "Sir, I will finalize the report for legal continuity review and then disengage from the system." And I nodded. And for the first time, I allowed myself to sit down, not because anything demanded it, but because nothing did anymore. And the chair felt heavier than I remembered, as if the room itself was finally releasing its tension. And I looked at Emily again and said, "You do not need to decide anything tonight." And she looked at me, as if she had expected consequences to continue unfolding, but I continued, "Some decisions only exist because people are still reacting, and we are no longer reacting." And there was a long silence then, not uncomfortable, but empty in a peaceful way, and I realized how rare that feeling had become in my own home. And I thought about Jason not with anger, but with distance, the way you think about a storm after it has passed and left nothing behind but rearranged objects. And I said softly, almost to myself, "He believed control was the same as structure." And Thomas responded without turning around, "Many people confuse the two, sir." And I nodded because that was exactly right. And then I stood again and walked out of the office, not toward any system or screen, but toward the kitchen where the first real light of morning was now touching the counter. And I noticed how ordinary everything still looked, How the house had not changed even though everything inside its interpretation of authority had, and Emily followed a few steps behind me but did not speak, and I did not ask her to. Because silence between people who are no longer fighting is different from silence between people who are still deciding whether to fight, and I poured a glass of water and stood there for a moment simply listening to the quiet. And I realized that what I had been protecting for so many years was never just ownership. It was continuity, the ability for things to remain stable without being rewritten by whoever spoke last. And Thomas appeared briefly in the doorway and said, "Sir, the system is now fully stable. No further anomalies detected," and I replied, "Good," not as a command, but as acknowledgement that the world had returned to its baseline. And when he left, Emily finally stepped beside me and said softly, "What happens now?" And I looked at her for a long moment before answering, because that question had nothing to do with systems or documents, and I said, "Now you see what remains when noise is removed." And she asked, "And what remains?" And I turned slightly toward the window where the light was growing stronger and said, "Only what was real enough to survive being misunderstood." And in that moment I understood that I was no longer inside a conflict, I was inside its aftermath, and the most important thing left was not to explain what had happened, but to decide what kind of silence would follow it, because silence is where families either rebuild truth or repeat illusion, and for the first time since the alarm had gone off at 3 in the morning, I was no longer thinking about what had been taken or corrected. I was thinking about what could finally be left alone without needing to be defended. The morning after everything had settled felt nothing like resolution. It felt like distance, the kind that appears when a place you once believed was full of tension finally becomes quiet enough for truth to echo inside it. And I remember standing in the kitchen of my Westlake Hills home watching sunlight move slowly across the marble counter. The same counter that had held tension, voices, and uncertainty only hours earlier, and now there was only silence. But it was no longer the kind of silence filled with conflict. It was the kind that arrives after something irreversible has already been understood, and I noticed Emily sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a simple cup of coffee, not speaking, not avoiding, just present in a way that felt new, as if she was finally occupying her own thoughts instead of borrowing someone else's interpretation of them. And after a long moment, she said quietly, "I did not see what was happening until it stopped making sense." And I looked at her for a long time before responding, because honesty does not always arrive in dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrives in reflection, and I said, "Most people do not see clearly while they are inside a story someone else is still writing for them." And she nodded slowly, not defending, not resisting, just understanding. And that was the first real shift I felt from her, not agreement, but awareness. And later that morning, Thomas Reed returned briefly to finalize system handover documentation, and as he stood by the door he said, "Sir, everything has stabilized across all legal and security layers. There are no remaining active conflicts." And I thanked him, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement of closure, because there are people who enter your life only during moments of structural disruption and leave when stability returns, and that is exactly how it should be. And when he left, the house felt larger, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight of uncertainty had finally been removed from its walls. And I walked slowly toward my study where Jason had stood only hours earlier, and the space felt ordinary again, almost disappointingly so, like something that had briefly become dramatic and then remembered its true function. And I thought about Jason not with anger, but with clarity, because what remained of him in my mind was no longer conflict, but consequence. And consequences do not require emotional maintenance. They simply exist. And over the following days, I noticed small changes in how Emily moved through the house. She no longer checked her phone with tension in her expression. She no longer paused before speaking as if testing whether her words had permission to exist. And one evening, she said to me, while standing near the back porch, "I think I confused confidence with certainty." And I replied, "Many people do, especially when they trust the wrong source for too long." And she looked out toward the hills and said, "I do not want to live that way again." And I understood what she meant without needing further explanation, because rebuilding identity is not about rejecting people. It is about reclaiming interpretation. And as for Jason, his presence in our lives did not end with confrontation. It ended with disengagement. Professional systems completed their reviews. Access layers were permanently revoked, and what remained was not punishment, but separation. the natural result of misaligned authority structures correcting themselves over time, and there was no celebration in that, only quiet clarity. And I found myself spending more mornings outside, walking along the edge of the property, noticing details I had ignored for years, the sound of wind moving through trees, the way light changed across stone at different hours. Things that do not demand control, only attention. And in those moments I realized how much of my life had been spent inside systems, documents, responsibilities, decisions, and how little had been spent simply being present in what remained after them. And one afternoon Emily joined me on the porch without speaking, and after a while she said softly, "It feels different now." And I asked, "Different how?" And she answered, "Like nothing is pretending anymore." And I nodded because that was the closest description I had heard to peace in a long time. Not victory, not resolution, but absence of distortion. And I want to say this to you directly, not as instruction, but as something I learned slowly through experience. There are moments in life where people will try to define your reality for you, sometimes through authority, sometimes through closeness, sometimes through repetition, and if you stay inside that definition too long, you begin to forget that you were ever the one meant to define it. And I know many people listening to this understand what it feels like to question their own clarity because someone else sounded more certain, and if that is where you are, I want you to know you are not alone in that experience, because clarity is not something people give you. It is something you return to when noise finally stops being louder than truth. And if this story has reached you in any quiet way, thank you for staying with me until the end. Not because the story needed attention, but because moments like this are rarely shared in isolation, and I hope in some way it reminded you that boundaries are not distance, they are preservation, and that recognizing what is real is not an act of conflict, but an act of return. And if you found meaning in this story, feel free to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, not because of the channel, but because your voice might help someone else who is still trying to understand their own silence. And the one lesson I will leave you with is this: clarity always begins when permission is no longer required to see the truth. And as this story closes, there are others waiting in the same space between confusion and understanding. Stories of identity, inheritance, and the quiet rebuilding of self after everything familiar has shifted. And I invite you to continue with them when you are ready, because sometimes the next step is not forward, but deeper into understanding what has already changed. And wherever you are listening from, I am grateful you were here for this moment, and thank you for listening to this story.